Hello, delegates. Hi, my name's Aaisha. I'm the director for the Asia Cooperation Dialogue, which is an ECOSOC committee. I'm a third year student at Harvard, and I'm currently studying history and economics. And I do a lot of international relations stuff, mainly Model UN. Um, and I'm involved in a couple of different conferences which Harvard hosts, but primarily I do HMUN and then HMUN, which is the sister conference that Harvard hosts. Harvard IRC hosts for college students here in Boston. So without further ado, let's just start with today's webinar, which is supposed to be an introduction to Model UN for beginners. So the first question that comes to mind for someone who isn't familiar with Model UN or is doing it for the first time is what is the purpose of the UN and why do we do Model UN? So the UN is basically an international organization that was formed after World War II to oversee global affairs and to help maintain peace and to promote development. So Model UN basically is a conference that is modeled on how the UN works, and more specifically, the different committees that the UN has and the work that these committees do. So basically, Model UN is an academic simulation of UN committees where participants are considered as delegates who are representing different countries. So basically, you'll be the ambassador of whatever country you're assigned, and for the 4 days that you're at conference, you will think, act, speak, and behave like an official from that country. So your domestic policies and foreign policies, the laws and customs of your own country that you've been assigned will be more important than your personal beliefs or the beliefs of the country you're actually from. So the expectation is that for those 4 days, you'll be essaying the role of an ambassador from the country that you've been assigned. So usually students come to a Model UN conference as a delegation. They're part of a group. So a delegation is a group of participants, usually from the same high school, or can be from different ones as well. And each delegate in a delegation is assigned to a committee, which he or she will be a part of throughout the 4 days of conference. Some delegates might be might be just single delegate applicants who've not come with a delegation, and that's totally fine. But for those who've come with a larger group, you will be assigned a committee and a country. And the expectation is that you will be a part of the committee that you've been assigned for the next 4 days. So for example, if you're representing Sri Lanka in the Asia Cooperation Dialogue, you'll be called the delegate of Sri Lanka in third person throughout the conference when you're in committee session, and you're required to attend all committee sessions of your committee. You cannot transfer to another committee. You cannot sit in another committee session or a committee room during your session. So the expectation is that you're going to attend all the committee sessions of your country. And the idea is that basically you will learn through participation in this conference how your committee, how the UN works, and how different countries play a role, big or small, but largely still important in how the world works and how we're able to maintain peace and promote development. So we have a question over here that says, how long do we debate in a day? Usually it varies. So for example, on Thursdays, you'll have one committee session. That would mean probably 3 hours of debate on average. On Fridays, you usually have two committee sessions, which can mean almost double the amount of time. So you'll have a 3 to 4 hour session in the afternoon, and then maybe a 3 to 4 hour session in the evening. Same for Saturday. And then for Sunday, usually we have a 2 hour committee session in the morning, and then we wrap up the day. So it really varies, and different countries have, and different committees sometimes have different schedules that they're running on, but you will be made aware of this in your delegate handbooks when you arrive at conference. There is another question that says, are we allowed laptops? So conference policy is that yes, you can bring laptops, but you may not use electronics while you're in committee. So when committee sessions going on, you shouldn't typically be working on your laptops inside the committee room, but usually directors will give permission for delegates to go outside the committee room and use laptops. So I think the way this is going to work, and this is going to be most beneficial, is because there's some delegates who haven't done Model UN before and aren't aware of what the process is like. So I'm going to run through a few quick points, and then I'm just going to jump into answering all your questions. So why should you do Model UN, and why do people do it in the first place? What's the reason for all this interest? It's not just any extracurricular activity. Model UN gives you skill set that are going to stay with you for pretty much your entire life, whether you're working or whether you're applying to colleges or whether you're taking classes that are hard, because Model UN gives you a strong sense of awareness of international relations and global issues. It sort of hones your ability to think on your feet, to innovate, to connect with other people, and just to have a feel of what's it like to be in a room with a large number of people who have different interests, and you're all supposed to work together. So it's a great way to learn leadership, better organization, hone your negotiation skills, and improve your oration, your communication skills, build a network, and of course improve your confidence. And another thing that will aid all these, the development of all these skill set, is of course good research and good familiarity with whatever topic that's being discussed. So what does conference look like? Since some of you have asked these questions, so conference is typically on Thursdays. You have opening ceremonies, and then you start having your committee session, which is most of your time. And like I said, you have one committee session Thursday evening, two committee sessions Friday, two on Saturday, and then one on Sunday, after which you have closing ceremonies. So I'm going to run through how committee sessions usually look like. One thing you should be aware of is what the dais staff is, and what does dais mean. So dais is basically your committee staff, and it'll comprise your director, who is your head of committee. He or she guides substantive debate, approves all of your committee documents, will also moderate debate, and will basically ensure that the rules of procedure are being followed. And the director will be aided by assistant directors who are liaisons between the delegates and the director. And there are also people you can approach to if you have any substantive queries or any procedural questions. And then some committees might have crisis staff who deal with crisis elements that the committee has to deal with. In each session, usually you begin session by a motion to open debate. You start with roll call, and then the director might make a few announcements, and then you head on into debate. Debate generally can take two forms. Usually it starts off on Thursday with a general speakers list, and by the end of session on Thursday, delegates start raising moderated caucuses, and then usually it's preferred or at the director's discretion, however that may be, but generally discussion after Thursday is focused through moderated caucuses, and I'm going to tell you just in a minute what those two things are. So the general speakers list is basically an order of speaking. On the first day, when we're just beginning debate, the director will ask for delegates who wish to speak on a speakers list. You'll raise your placards. The director will recognize some of you, and an assistant director perhaps will be writing down names, and then you'll come up and start speaking, giving your views on the topic that's being discussed. The director may not be able to recognize all the delegates who raise their placards, so he or she may request you to send a note in to the dais staff so that you can be added to the speakers list. Please make sure that you know that once your name is on the speakers list, you cannot add it multiple times unless you've spoken and your name has been crossed out. So that's how speakers list works. And then after usually 15 or maybe 20 speakers, sometimes less, sometimes more, the director may wish to entertain motions for a moderated caucus. So moderated caucus is basically a motion through which delegates can focus debate in committee. So, for example, a typical moderated caucus will have a topic that you want a debate to be focused on. It will have a total speaking time. It will have an individual speaking time. So, for example, a delegate will raise a moderated caucus, asking or beckoning the committee to define what development means for a total speaking time of 10 minutes, individual speaking time of 1 minute. So that's sort of how you raise moderated caucuses. And these are the two formal ways in which debate is conducted in committee. A third way in which delegates might progress committee discussion is through unmoderated caucuses. And unmoderated caucuses are basically a time for delegates to break out into an informal session where they don't come up in the front of the room and give speeches, but instead they sort of meet with other delegates either inside the committee room or outside it, and discuss policy or progress of committee informally, and just make sure and just sort of check in into where other people are. So it's a little less formal, but it's still part of committee session, and you're still required to speak English, and you're still required to be following rules of procedure in terms of being respectful of other delegates and speaking in English also. And then, so these are the three ways in which committee progresses, and then usually typically at the end of every committee session, you suspend debate, and the process sort of just repeats in every committee session. So a few Model UN terms that you'll hear in committee session, which you should be aware of, are dilatory. So the director might rule something dilatory. It means that it is inappropriate and should not be repeated. The director might ask you to maintain decorum, which means that delegates should be quiet and should listen to whatever's happening in the committee session. The director might say a delegate is recognized, and that means that the delegate is allowed to speak. And then if a director says that he or she looks favorably upon a motion to do something, or favorably upon looks favorably upon a motion for an unmoderated caucus, that would mean that that's the direction the director wishes the committee to take, and it's usually a good idea for delegates to do whatever the director looks favorably upon doing. A few other things that you will be doing in committee sessions are submitting working papers and draft resolutions, and that's something I'll be talking a bit more about later. But for now, for first-timers, how do you prepare for conference and what do you do before conference? The first thing is that you should read the delegate preparation guide, which is available on the HMUN website. It's a very good way to orient yourself to expectations of HMUN India, to know what you should be expecting when you come to conference and the kind of environment that you'll be in for the next 4 days. The other thing is that you should make sure your delegation is registered and that you've been assigned a committee and a country to represent. Usually your faculty advisors are in charge of registration, so you should ask them if you haven't heard back from them. And once you know what committee and country you're representing, you should go to the HMUN India website, read up on the type of committee it is. Is it a General Assembly committee, an ECOSOC committee, or a special agency, or a specialized committee? The reason why this is important is because there are three categories of committees: GA, ECOSOC, and specialized agencies, and they have different expectations and different size of committee, which can be very important for delegates. So, for example, GAs are very large committees, can approximately have 200 people. So so the way you'll negotiate or meet people will be very different. The pace of the committee will be slightly different than what you'll see in an ECOSOC, which is a slightly smaller committee, can have anywhere from like 30 delegates to 80 delegates on average, or some numbers might differ. So it's a smaller group. People get the opportunity to speak more often, as opposed to a GA where there are 200 people, and if they all want to speak, then you might have to wait for a time before you're recognized again. EcoSocs might have crisis elements, which are external developments that the director thinks benefit committee. And then you have specialized agencies which run mainly on crisis and which might follow a slightly different procedure than GAs and EcoSocs. And there have been webinars on specific committee types, so you should look into those, or ask your committee directors if you have questions about what type of committee you have. But it's a good idea to read up on the type of committee you'd be attending, and of course, reading your background guide. So their background guide is a document that's written by your director that will give you a good starting point from where to think about your committee and the topic that you're discussing. It focuses on quite a few different aspects of the topic, mainly its history, it's the current situation of that topic, what solutions have been proposed, and how countries are working on it. It's a good idea. It's a good way to orient yourself to the committee and to start thinking about what you'll do from there onwards. I must stress that you should research well beyond what your background guide says, because almost all delegates are expected to have read the background guide. So just reading the background guide, not doing any research of your own, is not going to help you stand out. So good research based off of things you see in the background guide. What you discuss with your director. If you have any questions, you can always email them. And so you should research in addition to whatever's been written in the background guide. A good way to start research is looking at the sources that the director has used, and those you can find at the end of your background guide. And then another thing that you're required to do before conference is submit a position paper, which basically is a paper that's divided into 3 sections. History and background of the issue, your country's history and policy on the issue, and then your proposed ideas and policies for the committee. This is something that sort of is a basic outline from where you'll start working at committee. So this is not just a good idea for you to submit because it's, well, a requirement of the conference, and this year they're due by August 6th, but it's also a good way for you to sort of orient yourself, to know what your country has done, and if you're a country which hasn't done a lot of the topics, then it will help you think about how you're going to do research and formulate your own policies. And then sort of attend as many webinars as possible, especially those that are relevant for you, because these are really helpful and will give you a good idea of what to expect in committee. So coming on to some of the substantive aspects of committee. One thing that delegates are expected to write up are working papers. So working papers are basically a plan for a potential resolution. It doesn't have a formal format, but it is expected to have or list points that have been discussed in committee in a way that is easy for people to follow, because you will be using, once you write up working papers, delegates will be discussing these working papers in committee session, probably for a couple of moderator caucuses and for the better part of committee sessions on either Friday or Saturday, whatever way your committee works. And this is basically a really good way to summarize what progress the committee has made and then direct it into further discussion. One thing that you should always keep in mind is that working papers should only contain points that have been discussed in committee. So if there's a point that you have that hasn't been discussed, just try discussing it. And if you're not recognized, sort of discuss it through other delegates, but make sure it's been brought forward before the committee, before you're entering it into the working paper, because otherwise your working paper might not be accepted, and that's not nice. if you worked on it and it's not acceptable. So the second thing, the second type of document you'll be working on is a draft resolution, which is basically the final document that your committee is supposed to prepare. Delegates might write up different draft resolutions. They might be signatories to different draft resolutions. But the committee can only pass one draft resolution per topic. And since HMUN India only has single topic committees, that means one committee will only pass one draft resolution. And the draft resolution is basically a document that recognizes the problem that the committee has been talking about, the progress that's been made so far, and then also proposes solutions that delegates have discussed in committee. And then at the end of committee, which is usually the last committee session, delegates vote on passing a draft resolution. One thing that I might note is that there might be certain draft resolutions that might not pass, and that's totally fine. But if there's a draft resolution that makes sense, and you think your country, the one you're representing, will vote for it, it'll probably be a good idea to vote for it. And again, so the reason why you're doing Model UN and doing all these formal debates and discussions is because you want to come up with a formal document that outlines ways in which this problem that you're talking about can be solved. So another thing to keep in mind is, why are we all convening to discuss a topic that world leaders have already discussed? Well, the simple answer is it hasn't been resolved, and there's still obstacles to making progress on it. And the reason why debate at this point is still important is because there are solutions which people haven't thought about or people haven't tried implementing. And therefore, why your role becomes so important in committee is that you have to bring in these original ideas that you've been inspired by from your research, but aren't exactly what people have already done. That's really going to set you apart as a good delegate. Because a delegate who takes initiative, who thinks on his or her own, and really brings new material in front of the committee, is a delegate who shows that he or she's interested and invested in the topic. And that's always nice to see for a director. The other thing that a draft resolution must do is it should answer all the questions the resolution must answer that your director has outlined in the background guide. So make sure you read those, you make sure that through your research you're able to answer those, and when you're negotiating and talking to other delegates, that you're focusing your debate and your discussion on answering those questions. The third substantive point that can come up in committee is crisis. So crises are external developments. They can take the form of, usually take the form of press releases or some expert eyewitness coming in to committee and giving delegates information. And basically, it's a way for a committee to delve into a real-time situation or an external development that is relevant to whatever the committee is discussing. But the committee beforehand might not have discussed this topic in particular. So it's a good way to direct committee discussion and to see in the real world how these proposals that the committee is talking about may pan out. And then another thing that your director might do is give you a sense of the committee timeline in every committee session. So the director might outline what he or she wants each particular committee session to achieve. Usually directors will tell at what time during the committee they'll start accepting working papers, how many working papers they'll be accepting if there is a limit on it, and same for draft resolutions. They'll tell you when they expect them and how many they'll be accepting. And then they might also tell you to limit the length of your document just to make sure that you're not adding things that shouldn't be there and it's relevant and conducive to discussion. Once again, originality is key, and make sure you research well and you know your topic and ways in which you can improve and add to the global discussion that's already taking place. So just in a nutshell, what's a successful delegate? A successful delegate will know what committee he or she is attending, will know what type of committee it is, what the topic is, and will be well researched. Will The delegate will follow their own country's policies, will keep aside their personal preferences and personal opinions, and focus on being an ambassador of the country they've been assigned. They will attend all committee sessions and participate actively. This is something that's important because for a lot of people who do Model UN for the first time, it can be a little bit of an intimidating experience when you see people who are all dressed in Western business attire, all have researched their committee topics, seem to be in the flow of things and to know what they're doing. And so sometimes first-time delegates tend to take a seat back and just see how things are panning out. And they sometimes think that just by looking at how other delegates are doing, they'll get a better sense of how committee is supposed to do. While that might be a good idea and might seem logical in most situations, sort of sitting back, seeing how others are doing it and following, in Model UN, usually the best way to perform well is to actually perform. So these webinars will be put up perhaps on a YouTube website or a channel where you can review them, or you can always talk to your director, email them before conference, but just make sure that you're always participating. And there are all these aids that you have, so sort of these webinars and your director and your assistant committee directors, to ensure that you actually speak up in committee, raise your placards, talk in unmoderated caucuses, and make sure that you're visible in committee. And that's how you're going to learn. That's how other delegates are going to know that you're present, that you're a voice that should be listened to, that your country is important, and that you contribute, and basically essentially that at the end of the day you've contributed to committee. And that's what being a successful delegate is about. So if you feel that there are people who know more than you, unless you speak up, you won't know more than them. So basically, you learn through participation. Don't be afraid to speak up. There are many people who do Model UN for the first time, and they really enjoy it. And the thing is basically to have fun, to know what you're talking about, which just makes participation so much easier. So I definitely encourage all of you to speak up, whether or not you're first timers, because that really will define your Model UN committee experience. A successful delegate will also be open to new ideas, to meeting new people, to collaborating with countries who it hasn't collaborated with in the past. And that's sort of the mark of a good delegate. Can you convince countries who usually do not want to work with you to work with you? Can you guys find similarities to build an alliance on, to build a block on? So which brings me on to the next point, which is a successful delegate will build alliances, will build networks with other delegates and this is not just important to make sure that whatever documents you're coming up with are comprehensive and deal with different aspects of the issue, some of which might be particular to certain countries or certain regions, which your own country might not be a part of, or which it might not face, but is still important in context of the larger problem that we're discussing. But it's also important because when you submit these documents and draft resolutions especially, and you begin voting on them, you want people to support your draft resolution and to vote in favor of it. And even before voting, you need to have a particular number of signatories for the director to accept your draft resolution. So build alliances, meet new people. That's a really important and fun aspect of Model UN. Next, as I've emphasized time and time again, that a successful delegate will be innovative, they'll bring original ideas, and they will show that they're interested and invested in the topic, not just in committee, but outside it as well. And a successful delegate will never be confused. A successful delegate will always clarify his or her concerns with the director or the assistant directors, and will make sure that they utilize the resources that are at their disposal. And most importantly, you should have fun, you should stay involved, and you should always be open to new ideas and to making sure that you're working with other people, even if you haven't worked with them before during earlier committee sessions. Just make sure that you're not closed off Because at the end of the day, if there's one word that that MOL-UN can be summed up by, that's diplomacy. So now I'm going to go over a lot of the questions that you guys have asked, and you can sort of keep them coming in, and I'll answer them. So how many members should a delegation have for it to be called a small delegation? Since this question doesn't directly relate to the webinar we're doing, I'd suggest you email the info account so that you can have a better idea, because they deal with registrations. Being from DISEC, what thing should I keep in mind being a beginner? So DISEC is a General Assembly Committee. A General Assembly Committee means that you would probably have around 200 people, if they all show up, in your committee. And the DISEC is, in fact, one of the most important GA committees. A few of the baseline things that are important for all committees will be important for DISEC as well. So read your background guide. If you have any questions, get in touch with your director and research on the issues that your director has highlighted in the background guide. If you feel that you've come across certain aspects of the issue that are unique or have developed after your background guide was written, take a note of those as well, and those will be very important, because that will set you apart from other delegates who might not have done as thorough research. So just make sure that you're on point, and that you know where your committee is going. DISEC can also be a very fast-paced committee, and a lot of delegations might send some of their best delegates to DISEC. And what that means is that you have a great chance to meet and collaborate with people who probably have done this before, and who have great ideas to bring to the table. And for you to be able to collaborate with them and bring your ideas is a great way to learn about how international diplomacy works. But one thing you should make sure, and that's something that can be tricky in DISEC, is that you know what kinds of proposals you can make. So the DISEC is not the Security Council, so make sure you're not suggesting proposals that DISEC does not have the mandate to suggest. So make sure you know what the structure of your committee is, and get in touch with your director if you have any other queries. So there's another question that says, what do we do after committee sessions? So that's a very good point. Usually, because HMUN is a very fast-paced committee or conference, delegates might choose to work on working papers, not just during committee sessions, when sometimes they go outside for small periods of time and work on their laptops to write working papers or draft resolutions. But most successful delegates also spend time outside committee or after committee sessions working on working papers and draft resolutions. But most importantly, what you should utilize your time outside committee sessions to do is to take part in or participate and attend the social events that HMUN has planned for you. Meet other delegates, meet the delegates from your committee outside session, build friendships with them, build networks with them. Make sure you know them as people and not just as delegates, because that will really help HMUN be a very nice experience for you. Some of my great friends that I've had over the years, friendships I've built with people from all around the world, have been through Model UN, and meeting up with them after committee session is usually a great way to do that, because you don't really have other obligations, and it's just a great way to meet people at conference. What preparations should be done? I think I answered this question in my webinar, and this was sent fairly in the fair beginning of the webinar, so I think we're covered on that. Do we expect working papers at the end of the first session? Typically, no, because the first session is usually when delegates are orienting themselves to the topic, and sort of everyone is getting a sense of where the level of debate of the committee will be at and what the director expects from the committee. If the director expects a working paper at the end of the first session, they'll probably let you know well in advance, but I don't think you should be worrying about writing a working paper at the end of your first session. Typically, directors start accepting working papers somewhere on Friday, so either the second or the third session. Usually it's the end of the second session, but again, your directors will tell this for you. You shouldn't really be worrying about it on the first day though. Use of electronics. So like I said before, electronics, you can use them, but not in the committee room. You can go outside your committee, work on your laptops or tablets or whatever you have, use your cell phones. But during committees, use of cell phone, laptops, tablets, or any kind of electronics device is strictly forbidden. And disciplinary, your director might call you out on that, might ask you to put the device away. So just make sure you're not using them in the first place, because it's disrespectful to other delegates in the committee. It's against conference policy, and it just makes things unpleasant. So you can't use electronics while you're in committee session and in the committee room, but you can use them outside them. If your director has different directions or different ways in which he or she wants you to use your electronics, they'll let you know, and then you should follow their advice on that. What are the awards that delegates can receive? So typically it's individual delegate awards are best delegate, outstanding delegate, and honorable mentions. Sometimes there will be verbal commendations, but there might not be. But best delegate, outstanding delegate, and honorable mention are typically the awards that are handed out. And then the number of awards per committee can vary just because of the size of committees. So typically, General Assembly committees will be much bigger than the others, so they'll have more awards, and then ECOSOC will have fewer awards, and then typically SA committees have even fewer awards, sometimes only 3 or 4. But that again depends on the size of your committee and how many delegates there are. How much time will one get for this speech? So there are two kinds of speeches you can make. The first one is the general speakers list speech. The default time for that is set to 1 minute. Delegates might motion to increase or decrease that time to whatever they want. Sometimes delegates want it to be 2 minutes. It's at the discretion of the chair whether or not they want the time to be changed and whether or not they'd be happy with whatever you're suggesting, but typically the committee will then vote on it, the new time that's been proposed, and if that passes, then that'll be the new time for the general speakers list, and that will remain the time that the delegates will be allowed to speak throughout, unless there's a motion to change that time again. For the moderated caucuses, for each moderated caucus, there'll be a different total and individual speaking time. So for example, if a delegate raises a motion and it passes, the delegate will typically have told what the total time and individual speaking time for that moderated caucus would be. So for example, if it's a motion to discuss the US-Iran nuclear deal for a total time of 15 minutes, individual speaking time of 1 minute, it will mean that every delegate who's recognized can speak for 1 minute, and then there'll be 15 delegates in total who will be recognized for that moderated caucus. But there are different time limits. Sometimes it can be that total speaking time 10 minutes, individual speaking time 30 seconds. So in that way, every delegate that's recognized is recognized for 30 seconds, and then they have to sit at the end of 30 seconds. Typically, directors will also tap their gavel when you have a certain amount of time left. So maybe when you have 10 seconds left, the director will tap once, and when you're done or your time is up, the director will tap twice to know your time's up, and then you should just go back to your seat. Another thing I should mention over here as well is that when you raise moderated caucuses, so for example, you've raised one for 15 minutes and you feel that the topic that was being discussed still has some room for discussion, additional discussion, and you want to bring in points that haven't been discussed, you can extend or motion to extend a moderated caucus as well, and that will have a different time. So say if your first one was 15 minutes, individual speaking time 1 minute, your extension can be of 5 minutes, individual speaking time of 30 seconds. So that's completely acceptable. How do we prepare for our position papers? So position papers are basically focused just on the topic and then what your country can do for that topic and what it's done in the past. So the way you research for that is a general research on what your topic's about, what the problem is, why is it important, things like that, and then move on to policies. In the second section, move on to policy that your that your country has already implemented. Perhaps include UN resolutions or other resolutions or other treaties that your country has signed, other conventions that it follows, which sort of relates to a resolution on the topic, and then a section on what your proposed solutions are. So it's basically very focused on your solutions to the problem and what the position of your country is on that particular problem. Again, if you read the delegate preparation guide, there's a very good section on how to write working position papers and what's expected of you when you write them. So you should definitely check that out. How long does a speakers list last? Now that's a very interesting question. So the speakers list is usually started on Thursday, and after a few speakers, when the director starts accepting moderator caucuses, typically debate then is conducted through those moderator caucuses. How moderator caucuses take place is that when the director says, the director will now be accepting motions, delegates will raise their placards, the director will recognize delegates. So say the delegate of Malaysia gives one motion, delegate of Barbados gives another, delegate of Saudi Arabia gives another, the United States gives one more. And then in order of most to least disruptive, in terms of their time, the director will read out those motions, and then the committee will vote on those motions. So how that process works is that, say, the most disruptive motion was the one from the delegate of the United States. The director reads it out. The director says, all those in favor of this motion, that means if you want to discuss this motion, you raise your placards. Delegates raise their placards. The director asks all those opposed, if you don't want this motion to be discussed, you raise your placards. All this while, the dais staff is counting the votes for each so like all those in favor and all those opposed. And then if a motion passes, that means if it has more for than against votes, you'll move into discussion on that motion. If it doesn't pass, it fails, then the director will move on to the next disruptive motion, say the motion from the delegate of Malaysia. And so the director will keep on going through motions until one passes. If all motions fail, then automatically the committee will start will go back to the general speakers list. So for example, if so the speakers list is actually a continuous list of names of countries. So if you, for example, before the speakers list was cut off and you went on to moderator caucuses, you had 20 speakers who had spoken, delegates who had spoken. So now that when you go back, whichever country is listed as the 21st country on that list will automatically get a chance to speak. And that way, delegates can keep on adding their names to the speakers list, so it doesn't generally end. It always has names of delegates who wish to speak. But you should keep in mind that if since debate is usually directed through moderator caucuses, and eventually after a few speeches the director might ask for more motions, and once those passes you'll be debating in moderator caucuses. So you must keep in mind that not everyone who has their name on the speakers list will always get a chance to speak on the speakers list. Is a working paper made in a coalition of countries or by a single delegate? So working paper can be made by either a block of countries or by a single delegate. It doesn't really need a minimum amount of signatories to be accepted by the director. However, it's usually a good idea to work with other countries and other delegates, because that means that your working paper will be more comprehensive, will help you build alliances, and will sort of ensure that you have support in committee, will keep you on track with what other delegates are doing. And also, it just shows that you're negotiating, that you're being diplomatic, that you're being respectful, and by identifying the needs of other countries and other delegates, even though they might differ from yours, and that means that you're working as a team. And that's basically what the Sparrow Model UN is about. So it's usually a good idea to work with other people on working papers, but of course, if you find that it's impossible or you can't do that, then you can write a working paper by your own self. Some directors might not accept individually written working papers, so you might want to ask them, ask your own director if that's something that they're okay with, but generally that's fine. How do countries not directly related to the topic approach the topic? So that's the beauty of Model UN. It makes you realize that since we're living in a global world, every country is directly or indirectly related to the problem at hand. So it might be that the problem that you're discussing hasn't been the focus of heated debate in your country, but it doesn't mean that that doesn't affect your country. So, for example, if you're talking about nuclear weapons and you're a small island in the middle of the Pacific, then yes, you might not have nuclear weapons, you might not have a nuclear policy, but you're still at threat from nuclear weapons, or you're still living in a world where nuclear weapons are a topic that's been discussed and is very pertinent. So you can start by researching on the topic and what the general aspects of discussion are, and then see how that relates to policies in your country. So has your country signed any nuclear pacts? Is it a part of NATO, or does it have military alliances, even if they're not nuclear alliances, or like even if they're not like directly related to nuclear programs? Have you signed particular treaties, however big or small they might be? You can go to UN voting records and see what resolutions your committee has voted for in conjunction with this. Especially if you're in a General Assembly committee, it means by all accounts your country was present in most cases when this topic was being discussed in the UN. So they must have voted either way or abstained. And get a general feel of what policies in your country are like. So if your country is conservative, let's say, on economically conservative, or like your policies will then, if you're talking about trade, for example, or other things, should also be economically conservative. So you can draw out parallels from the larger way your government functions, and sort of get a sense of what would your country do if it was faced with this problem, even if it's not directly faced with this problem right now. And that's one thing Model UN teaches you, because you're the ambassador for your country. If you face this, given the character profile of your country, what would you do? Another good way to look at things and research is see what your closest partners are, especially economic partners, and sort of see what their policies are, because usually if countries are close to other countries, they tend to agree with a lot of their policies. But that's not a short way of knowing what would be okay in your country, because sometimes countries who otherwise get along really well do not agree on certain points. So don't follow things blindly, but just make sure you're making good choices. And again, talk to your director if you have any other questions. So how do you find a country's real position on any issue? The internet would be your best and most efficient way to find that, because you use Google or any search engine, research, read newspapers, read journal articles, go to websites, and basically you can search on the topic like you search on any other topic that interests you and research. You can read books or other sources of information. That's entirely up to you. But you typically won't find one page that encapsulates everything that your country will do on an issue. You have to work on it, and that's why you're expected to research well in order to do well at committee. Does the crisis occur during moderator or unmoderated caucus? I won't say it can't occur, but typically the director will wait for whatever the committee is doing, whether it's a moderated caucus or an unmoderated caucus, to introduce a crisis so that you're done with one thing and then you move on to the next, so that the moderated caucus or unmod is not disruptive. That's how it usually happens. But if the director feels like they want to introduce it in the middle of a moderated caucus, then, or if there's a time-sensitive issue or something, then they might introduce it at their own discretion during unmod or mod. But typically it's not done during any of those. Can you please elaborate well researched? That's a very good question. That's also a very abstract question because well researched basically can mean different things to different people. What you should basically ensure is that you know your topic well, that you know what your country will do when it's faced with that problem, what it's currently doing, and you should be able to improvise on spot if you have a crisis that your country has not dealt with. You should have a very good idea of how to respond to that. A well-researched delegate will basically know most of what's there to know about the topic and will know especially their country position, but also sometimes the position of other bloc countries. They will know who they should be collaborating with, who they shouldn't be collaborating with. They will know what other countries are doing in order to collaborate with them, because sometimes, since not all delegates are well researched, if you know more about someone else in their committee than their country, then that's a good way to bring them on board and make them see how you can be a good ally for them. So there are different levels of comfort when it comes to knowing what your topic is and how well you've researched. But basically, if you can answer anything that comes up in committee and respond to crises and respond to topics effectively, then that means you've done your job well. If you're sitting in committee and you don't know what to say, or you can't draw links between what's being discussed and why it's important, then that means you're not well researched and you can't join the dots, which basically means you should read up more. Are there any videos of previous HMUN debates on YouTube? I haven't checked, but you can search, and if you find any, those will be helpful. We will be trying to put up these webinars, and if that's done, you will probably get an email about it, or you'll know somehow. How do I find my country's stand when my committee is a UNDP? It has an extremely vast agenda. So that's why committees have committee topics. So read your background guide, look at what your committee will be discussing for the purpose of this conference, and then see what your country has done in terms of tackling that problem or responding to that situation. A lot of countries have very vast agendas, bigger, especially General Assembly committees. But the purpose of narrowing debate through a particular topic is so that you can know what aspect of development, say, you should be focusing on. Again, if you have questions, you should ask your director, but make sure that not just the focus of or the mandate of your committee is something you research, but also research in light of what your topic is, because you can't know possibly everything that there is to know about your country. So focus on the topic. I can't remove ads from your browser windows because you have a trackpad or a mouse and only you can do that. are we allowed to cross-question delegates? So no crosstalk is allowed during committee. When a delegate is speaking during a speakers list or moderator caucus, you're expected to remain quiet and listen to them. If you wish to talk to delegates who are sitting on your sides or are sitting in another part of the room, you might pass notes to them. Notes are sometimes delegates, South Asian delegates called chits. At HMUN India, you'll be calling them notes because for the purpose of the conference, there's no such thing as chits. So you'll be passing notes to other delegates if you want to talk. Make sure that these notes are formal, are respectful, and are relevant to what's being discussed in committee. They shouldn't be random talk. They shouldn't be about things that are not related to the committee or to the conference. Do you have the permission to speak to the delegate who's speaking or giving a speech? No, you do not. You only listen to that delegate, and if you have something to say to them, you can either send them a note after they sit down, or meet them outside the committee session or after committee, or you might discuss, you might raise your placards, and if you're recognized, you can respond to them when you come up to speak. But during their speech, you can't cut them, you can't respond to them. The only time you can ask delegates is during the general speakers list. If a delegate is giving a speech and say the total time was 1 minute, they've wrapped up their speech in like 30 seconds, and they haven't yielded to the chair. So if they yield their time to questions, that means that the chair will the director will recognize delegates who can ask the speaker questions until the remaining time of 30 seconds has elapsed. So that's one way you can cross-question delegates if that opportunity presents itself. The other way you can speak right after a delegate, but not quite cross-question them, is if they forget to yield their time to the chair, then automatically 2 comments for 30 seconds each are allowed. And if you wish to speak, you may raise your placards and ask the director to recognize you for giving comments. And if the director does so, you can give comments right after that speech, but you can't interrupt a speaker while he or she is speaking. How much can a delegate in an ECOSOC expect to speak during the 4 days of conference? That varies because ECOSOCs have different number of delegates in each committee. So that you can either have a committee of 30 people or you can have one of 80 people or somewhere in between. So it depends on how many people there are. If it's a smaller committee, you'll have more chance to speak. If it's a larger committee, you have less chance to speak. Another thing that this is dependent on is how many people wish to speak. So if everybody wishes to speak, which is ideal, you might get less chance to speak. But then that would mean that if your speeches are good, then you will make an impact regardless. If less people speak, directors will still insist that delegates who are not speaking should speak up, raise their placards. They will still try to make those delegates speak, but still you might have a more frequent opportunity to get a chance to speak if not many people are speaking. That said, your performance evaluation in committee is not just based on how many times you speak, because directors are experts and they know the size of their committee well and the topic well and what positions of different countries are. They will know sometimes really good delegates might not have the opportunity to speak a lot of times. Sometimes very good delegates only get to speak once in a committee session if it's a General Assembly committee. But if your speech is good, if you're doing good work in unmods and moderator caucuses, if you're sending notes, if the director can see that you're collaborating with other delegates, then it shows that you're invested in the committee and that you're a good delegate. So you shouldn't be very worried about how many number of times you speak. If you raise a motion for a moderated caucus and if it is passed, then yes, the delegate who raised the moderated caucus will be the first delegate to speak on that topic. How can we be sure of what solutions our country would reasonably propose, just its policies? So a lot of it you can sort of get an idea of when you read through their policies. But then think about policies on your own. Look at things that other countries have done. Look at policies that are in process of being discussed or being approved. Think how those policies can be improved upon. What would you do if you were in that situation, given the restrictions that your country places on your performance, because you have to think like your country, innovate solutions, be original, and just make sure that you're not doing something that's blatantly against your country policy. So if your country does not have an army or does not look favorably upon military intervention or being part of military alliances, and you commit to a military alliance and you say that it's good that we should intervene in a certain situation, as opposed to pursuing diplomatic negotiations, then you're doing something wrong, and you should not be doing it. But then again, this can change depending on what situation there is, because there can be exceptions, but just make sure you're not blatantly opposed to your country's policies, domestic and foreign. Sample working paper has quite a lot of info. How much of that info is the delegates' views and how much of it is actual research and fact? I haven't read the sample working paper, but the working paper that you're expected to write will have research, will have facts, of course, but will also have information and ideas that the delegates have presented during committee session. So it just depends on the time that your director expects working papers and how much the committee has progressed from the start of committee session up to that point where they're accepting working papers. So it depends committee to committee. How do we use comments? So I'm assuming these are comments to speeches that I mentioned you can make after the general speakers list speeches. So those are comments that you can basically talk about or comment on the speech that was just given. So you shouldn't go off on a tangent and talk about something that's completely different. If you're commenting on someone's speech, then whatever time you have, you will comment on the speaker who just went before you. And it's basically your opinion or anything you think about that speech. Okay, so sample position paper and how much of that is fact is how much that is research. So your actual research should be factual. Ideally, it shouldn't be fiction. But your sample position paper, obviously, the history and discussion of the problem and what your country has done will be research, will be facts, will be things your country has actually done. You can't make those things up because that's just not appropriate. And then the policies you propose will obviously be coming out from your research. You can't talk about something that hasn't been done before because it has to be based on reality. But you can, it's expected that the policies you propose will have built upon things that have been done and will bring something that's new or something that's different than what your country has done in the past. So that will have more elements of what you think should be done and how your committee should progress forward. But it still be based on facts and research, and it can't be something that, I mean, it'll be something that probably hasn't been done before, but it's something that should be plausible and that should be possible given the things we can do in the world and given what your research has shown you. Do we expect crisis in ECOSOC committees? Yes, you can have crisis in ECOSOC committees. Typically, there are not that many crises in ECOSOC committees compared to specialized agencies where there the committee basically runs on crisis. So yes, you can expect crisis. Directors may introduce them at different points in time. There'll be different intensity of crises, but you can expect them. Sometimes General Assembly committees will also have crises, but that's less frequent, just because of the nature of committees. So in Rajya Sabha, how exactly do we present our point as the person we are representing or the party? This is a question you should definitely write to your director about. You should email him about this. Your director is Aman Rizvi. But just to sort of address this question from my understanding of it, is you'll obviously be, since you're representing a character, usually characters and their policies are in line with party policies, though that might not always be the case. But your primary responsibility is to follow or to do as your character would have done in actual life. In case where a precedence is absent, you can obviously look at party policies and see if your character would have supported those policies or not. So that's a fine balance, but your priority is to, I think, to stick with your character and then obviously follow your party policy as well. But you should definitely get in touch with your director about it. Some research links in the background guide do not seem to work. What do I do? So background guides also have proper citations, not just links. So if you type in what the actual document is, what its title is, you should be able to find out that document. If not, you can always email your director and they should be happy to let you know where they got that information from. Are we allowed to send notes via the EB? If yes, then what kind of notes should be sent this way? I'm not exactly sure what EB means. Oh, executive board. Okay. So if you're writing notes to other delegates and you're being respectful and you're following conference rules, you can send those notes directly to other delegates. Usually we'll have pagers who are delegates who will volunteer to help transfer notes between delegates, and you can directly send notes to other delegates. If the director finds that those notes are being misused and delegates are writing things they shouldn't be writing and there are inappropriate comments on them, then the dais staff, which is what you call the executive board at HMUN India, will either request all notes to first come to the dais staff before they be handed out, or might also just tell you, or might also just stop note sending, which is a little extreme, and they usually don't do that. But they might if the situation gets out of hand. So just make sure you send notes wisely and respectfully, and you're aware of the decorum that's expected of you while you're at conference. If you're writing notes directly to the dais staff, then you can just send them to a pager, and the pager will give it to the director, assistant directors. So there's a question/comment on what you can write on those notes if you're writing to the dais staff. So you can basically clarify any query you have. Sometimes after some delegates arrive after roll call, which should not be happening. But if you arrive in the committee session after roll call and your name has already been called out, you should write your name on a note and say that you're present and send it up to the dais staff. That's one way. If you want something to be clarified, if you forgot the time working papers were supposed to be submitted, you can write a note to the dais and they can let you know, remind you of that. And basically any substantive or procedural query that you have, you might write a note to the dais staff and they respond to you if it's a valid query. And then, of course, if you wish to be added to the speakers list, you should write your name on a note and send it up. What kind of speech should you prepare? So that really depends on your topic, and at what point you're giving a speech on the general speakers list. Um, if it's at the beginning of the first session, then you might want to start off introducing a topic, congratulating everyone that they're here, sort of setting the tone of excitement and encouragement for the committee, talk about what your country has done, why this topic is important, what you look forward to doing at conference, just basic general broad things. Again, I can't give you a footprint because it depends on what has, obviously if you prepared a list and you're like 10th on the general speakers list and 9 other people have said the same thing, the speech you have prepared might not be the best speech you can give because 9 other people have already said it, so you might want to change it on spot. Just make sure you go with the flow of committee and improvise, because that's what an actual delegate would do. If you're a smaller country, and you don't have lots of material in your research. Now, I already answered this question earlier on, and I'm kind of going to give the same answer. Try to have a feel of what your committee would do or what your country would do in this given situation. Look at its policies related to similar topics. Think about projects that people in that country have started, or if the government has given implicit support for something, if the government has signed treaties with other countries, or has voted on different UN resolutions. Then you can also look into close partners of the country, countries that it is allied with, especially countries it receives economic aid from or has good trade relations with, depending on whatever country or you're talking about and what the topic is like. And then sort of get a sense of what those countries do, because typically if countries have good relations with other countries, they tend to have similar policies or tend to support other countries and their policies. So that's a good way to start your research. But then also just get a feel of what general government policies are like. So for example, if you're discussing democracy in your country's a military dictatorship, you might not want to be speaking very strongly in favor of democracy. So things like that. Just make sure you're not blatantly saying something that your country for sure would not be saying. How do you prepare for speeches you'll say in the mod? So since moderator caucuses are focused on particular topics, and it kind of depends on how the progress of the committee is going and what topics the committee wishes to focus on, that you'll sort of have to make your speeches and think about what you want to say as you go along. But just make sure for moderator caucuses that you're talking about what the topic for that caucus is. Like, don't talk about children's education if the moderator caucus is about maternal health. That just doesn't make sense. So make sure you're sticking to the topic. Make sure you're not talking about things that are irrelevant. Also, you should sort of highlight things that your country has done to make sure that other people know what points you bring to the table. If you are working with other people and you collectively agree on something, you can point that out. So there are many different ways you can make speeches. And then basically you improvise as you go along, because every committee will be different and I can't give one outline of what a speech is going to look like. Sometimes speeches need to be someone just directing committee, telling them, this is what the committee has done so far, this is what's left, and let's just focus on the things that are left. If the committee is going in all directions and delegates do not agree on something. So there are many ways in which committee can go forward, and you can utilize these speeches in order to do that. So just make sure you're always present and participating, and that's why participation is key, because unless you're aware of what's going in committee, you can't really contribute, and the speeches you make won't really make a difference or make a good impact if you don't know what's going on. So I know there are questions about the Rajya Sabha since it's different. So I can't talk particularly about that committee extensively because this webinar is not devoted to that, and there are people who have committed their time to watching this, expecting discussion to center around the particular topic. You should email your director, and if you have specific questions, he can answer them for you. He'll be happy to do that. And he'll be the best resource for that committee since he's the person who knows it best. We do not have a session devoted to lobbying. Lobbying means many different things. In terms of just gaining support and making sure that you know what other delegates are doing in committee and other delegates know what you're doing and that you're willing to negotiate. That's something that is happening all throughout conference. That's something that's happening when you write notes to delegates. That's something when you work on working papers or draft resolutions, when you sit outside committee sessions talking about policies, or when you meet outside after committee session and meet at social events. Basically, these are relationships you form and ways in which you collaborate on ideas, and that's something that's an ongoing process. So there's no one committee session where you only lobby, because essentially you're lobbying through debate and discussion, mods and unmods throughout the conference. So I'm really happy a lot of you found this session helpful. Again, thank you all for showing up. I had a great time running over the basics and answering your questions. Again, you're always welcome to write to your directors, email them if you have any other questions. They'd be more than happy to answer them for you. Their email addresses can be found in the background guide and on the HMUN India website. Also, just get in touch with the Secretariat if you have any other questions, or info@hmunindia.org if you have logistical questions. But just know that there are resources at your disposal, and that we all want you to have a great conference, and that we're really excited to be hosting you in just a few weeks. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.